Ladies and gentlemen, you are tuned into the Joseph Ben-Ami Show for Wednesday, October the 4th, 2023. I am your host, Joseph Ben-Ami, as always. Thank you so much for joining. Well, yesterday was election day in the province of Manitoba, and it started off not too bad for the Conservatives. The latest polling showed the Conservatives and the NDP running neck and neck, and in popular vote, it turned out pretty close to that, but not so much of the seat count. The NDP now have a majority government in the province of Manitoba. And the premier, former premier, I should say, of Manitoba, Heather Stefanson, has stepped down, or at least she's announced that she will be stepping down as leader of the Manitoba Progressive Conservative Party, which means that there will be a leadership race in Manitoba for whoever is going to lead the Conservatives as opposition leader and moving towards the next general election, which won't happen for another 4 years. So that is the outcome from the Manitoba general election. I was a little surprised. I thought the Conservatives would do a little better based on polling that I had seen. But look, it is what it is. The people of Manitoba have spoken, and the NDP has the right to now be the government. And while I think that it's appropriate for the Conservative Party to continue to act in opposition to the platform, to the policies of the NDP, to point out when there were problems with it, I'm kind of glad that they have their heads on straight with respect to respecting, no pun intended here, the outcome of a general election. Too often we hear in Democratic circles, and I mean Democratic, that is to say, Democratic elections. I'm not talking about the Democratic Party in the United States or the new Democratic Party here in Canada. I'm referring to democracy in general. We always hear about the rule of the majority. We always hear about respecting the rights of the minority and all of this stuff. What we don't really hear too much about is the obligation of the losing side in an election to be, I think, a little circumspect when it comes to trying to block the agenda of the newly elected party. I'm not entirely sure that that's always the right thing to do. Certainly, the right thing to do at a minimum is to continue to act in opposition, but opposition meaning highlighting and exposing the problems, the shortcomings, the mistakes, both of the government that has just been elected over a period of time, as well as the policies that they've implemented. But after, especially so soon after an election, to then turn around and say, well, we are going to block the government that has been duly elected from doing what it was elected to do, what its mandate is, I think that that's actually wrong. I don't think there's any reason to believe that that's going to happen in Manitoba, especially with a majority government. Very hard to do that here in Canada, but where it's not hard to do it is in the United States. It is possible, with their checks and balances that are entrenched in the Constitution, it's possible to have, let's say, a Democratic Party president and a Republican-controlled Congress. So that's entirely possible, and it happens from time to time. Or you could have a Republican president and a Democratic-controlled Congress. Either way, should Congress exercise its power over the purse strings in order to block a president's policy platform that he or she has just received a mandate from the voters to implement? That is something that I see more and more of in the United States. And it's really apropos to today, this discussion today. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on this, but as you probably have heard, especially, if you're following American politics, you know that the Speaker of the House of Representatives in the United States, Kevin McCarthy, has been ousted primarily at the instigation of a right wing, I'm going to call them a right wing rump of the Republican Party. And I'm not sure how that helps anything. Now, the offense here that Kevin McCarthy indulged in is that he perhaps broke some promises, some commitments that he made when some of the people that voted against him to get rid of him as Speaker, when they voted, many of them voted in favor of him as Speaker at the time because he made certain commitments with respect to spending and a legislative agenda, etc. And he probably felt compelled to step back from some of those commitments because he looked at the situation and felt that more damage would ensue both politically to the Republican Party and to the country in general if they had to shut down. And I use the term shut down because that's the way everybody expresses it. It's not really a government shutdown. There are departments that have to close their doors because the funding has run out. But, Social Security checks still go out, payments are still made to individuals. So it's not really fair to call it a government shutdown. I just use that term because that's the term that everybody else uses. So you understand what I'm talking about, even though it's not entirely accurate. So the Speaker of the House in the United States, and by the way, I am as hardcore a conservative as they come. So, maybe I shouldn't have to say that, but I just want to put my comments into context. I'm saying this isn't necessarily such a black and white conservative versus liberal, left versus right thing. The fact of the matter is that in politics, when you are running for office, you tell people where you stand on issues, you tell people what you want to accomplish when you're elected, and then once you're elected, you have to find ways to the best of your ability to implement all of the commitments that you've made. But at the same time, you have to recognize that close to half the population in the United States, for instance, and in Canada, when you have a majority government, you might have a majority government with somewhere around 40% of the popular vote, which means 2/3 of the people in Canada who voted actually voted against you and your policy proposals. So, you have to be a little bit more humble and a little more circumspect, I think, when it comes to trying to implement your policy. And I suspect that that was kind of where Kevin McCarthy's thinking was. That, whatever his commitments were, and I'm not defending him per se, I think it's a little incautious to make unequivocal commitments when you're talking about governing the country. You could talk about how you believe in something, you could talk about what you want to accomplish, but to be unequivocal and say, I will never under these circumstances do this or that or vote for this or that, that's incautious. And it's not just incautious, it's really not a very responsible way of moving into government. Again, the fact is that when you are governing, you have to make compromises because you have to recognize that you are not the only people in the room. You may be conservatives or Republicans may be the only people in the Republican caucus. Well, that makes sense. But when you talk about the House of Representatives, there are a whole bunch of people there who require representation, who require proper service from their elected officials collectively, who are not conservative and not Republican. So you have to find a way to strike a balance. Now, a balance may not be 50-50. It may be 95%, 90% Republican, 90% conservative, 10% liberal. I don't know. But you have to understand that politics is a transactional business. If you allow blind partisanship to creep into the actual act of governance, that's a recipe for hard feelings, ongoing conflict, and worst, paralysis when it comes to actually governing. And some of that plays out, ladies and gentlemen. It's not good enough to simply blame Joe Biden for the crisis on the southern border. You could legitimately blame Democrats, but not necessarily Joe Biden himself. Okay, maybe he hasn't done enough there. Maybe he's not doing enough. But are the Republicans, are they showing leadership in terms of providing funding, access to funding for the construction of that wall or barrier or whatever you want to call it? Alternatively, if we want to turn the clock back a little bit and think about what happened with Donald Trump when he was president, and Donald Trump promised he was going to build a wall. Again, a little unequivocal and incautious in the way he expressed to that. Because it's difficult. You're not going to build a wall if you don't have the money, and the President of the United States doesn't necessarily have those resources at his disposal or at her disposal. But he did run on this, and he did win an election on this, decisively, I might add. So the proper thing for the Democrats to do would have been to say, okay, you won. We're going to give you the money for this because that's what the people of this country voted for. But we are going to be on your heels all the time, Mr. President. We are going to point out whenever your policy that we have funded, because we respect the views of the people, we respect the decision of the people as expressed electorally, so we're going to give you the funding for the wall or whatever barrier you want. But you better build it, and it better be effective, because we are going to point out as the opposition everything wrong with your policy, everything wrong with how you're going about implementing your policy. That's the responsible way to conduct opposition. Okay, yes, sometimes because you have the power of the purse strings, sometimes it may be necessary to say, no, that's not happening. You don't have a mandate to do that, for starters. And even if you had a mandate, we wouldn't agree to it because it is egregious. Now, we don't have that problem here in Canada because we don't really have checks and balances in Canada. We talk cavalierly about our three levels of government, three branches of government, judicial, legislative, and executive. But in Canada, with the Westminster parliamentary system, the executive branch is deeply embedded in the legislative branch. So Parliament may have control over the money, theoretically, but because the cabinet is made up of members of Parliament, for the most part, you don't actually have to be a member of Parliament to be a member of the cabinet, but the tradition is that the cabinet is going to be made up primarily of members of Parliament, mostly members of the House of Commons, and the House of Commons has absolute control over the purse strings. But if the executive branch is embedded into the House of Commons, then it's only natural to assume that the House of Commons is going to agree to advance the money to the executive branch that they want, because the members of the cabinet are actually voting at the same time in the same body. So we don't have the same clear-cut distinction between executive branch and legislative branch here in Canada. So ironically, if a Donald Trump, let's say Donald Trump was running as the leader of one of the major political parties up here, because we don't have a direct election of president. So if you're the leader of a political party that wins the most seats in a general election, you become the prime minister. So let's say Donald Trump was the leader of the Conservative Party of Canada. And the Conservative Party of Canada forms a government. And let's say that we wanted to keep all of you big bad Americans out of Canada. So we want to put up a border wall. Not very practical. We have, between Canada and the United States, the longest undefended border in the world. So we want to defend that border in Canada. If Donald Trump was the prime minister and that's what he wanted to do, and he had his team, his cabinet behind him, he would have access to that money. He wouldn't have a whole lot of trouble getting the money to do it. But not so in the United States. So if he's going to make that promise, that's a tough promise for him to make. He should be able to get the money, because if he's running and he gets elected, That's part of the mandate that he received, and it's only responsible for the opposition parties, in this case it would be the Democrats, to vote the money for him because that's what the people voted for. And then, as I say, just be like dogs nipping at his heels the whole way through to ensure that what he promised is what he's going to deliver with that money, and it's going to be effective, and it's going to be delivered efficiently. That's responsible opposition. Trying to block everything, okay, is not responsible opposition. Yeah, use that if it's necessary, but when it becomes the only tool in your toolbox, that's a serious problem. Because in the final analysis, and I want to reiterate, I'm speaking now as a committed, hardcore conservative. At some point in time, you have to work together in government. And you have to recognize that mindless partisanship serves nobody's purpose ever. Well, that's interesting. We spent a whole quarter of an hour, the first segment, talking about all of that. And I think it's an important lesson to learn. I know not a lot of you out there, most of you maybe are going to disagree with me, but I'm a referee. I call them as I see them. I don't drink anyone's Kool-Aid, and I like to think that most of you refrain from drinking people's Kool-Aid as well. Let's go for our first break, ladies and gentlemen. When we come back, we have to talk more about what's going on in the Catholic Church. We discussed a little bit about this last night with regards to same-sex marriage. We're going to get back into that a little bit. But in addition to that, more stuff going on with this Pope. It's really quite unbelievable. So don't go away, ladies and gentlemen. You're going to want to stick around for that. We'll be back in a couple of minutes here on the Joseph Ben-Ami Show.
Ice cream. Give me ice cream with whipped cream. Ice cream. Give me ice cream with whipped cream. Ice cream. A million flavors, let's just do it. Tie me up with ice cream. Sunny days need that cold hit. Ice cream. A million flavors, let's just do it. Tie me up with ice cream. Sunny days need that cold hit. That strawberry chocolate taste. High school vanilla for me. Hundreds and thousands. I need an ice cream island. Give me ice cream with whipped cream. Strawberry sauce. And see my face gleam. I need a wafer on top. Just ice cream full stop. So take me to the pudding shop. Ice cream. A million flavors, let's just do it. Tie me up with ice cream. Sunny days need that cold hit. Ice cream. A million flavors, let's just do it. Tie me up with ice cream. Sunny days need that cold hit. That strawberry chocolate taste.
There is just a feeling that this might be right for us, for you and me. There is just a look, I think this might be right for us, for you and me. There is just a feeling that this might be right for us, for you and me. There is just a look, I
All right, here we are back on the Joseph Ben-Ami Show for Wednesday, October the 4th, 2023. I'm your host, Joseph Ben-Ami. Thanks so much for sticking with us. All right, let's get into this whole business with the Catholic Church. Let me preface what I have to say on this. I did talk a little bit about this last night. I want to reiterate. I don't have a dog in the hunt. I don't have a horse in the race, or whatever other cliche simile that you want to come up with, metaphor, in order to make the point. So I'm always a little reluctant to get into a discussion about what's going on internally in other religious groups and other theological groups. And it's not any different when it comes to the Catholic Church. But in this case, last night, we talked a little bit about same-sex marriage in the Catholic Church. We'll talk about that a little bit more again in a minute. But I wanted to, first of all, put what I have to say into some sort of context. I'm not making theological arguments. Any argument that I make and questions that I raise about the position of the Pope or the position of the Catholic Church on a particular public policy issue is strictly based on the facts around public policy, and I would never make a theological argument. There's no way of winning theological arguments because they are theological, they're metaphysical. We can debate things, we can talk about, inductive logic, etc., but the fact is, ladies and gentlemen, that I don't have the right to criticize or critique another religion, as a theological enterprise. And that's not what I'm doing. What I want to do, ladies and gentlemen, is I want to talk about what's going on in the Catholic Church because of the importance that I attach to the Catholic Church in terms of being a bulwark, albeit a weakened bulwark, against the advance of secular liberalism that has completely seems to have taken over our society. And I think that the Catholic Church and Christianity in general, but the Catholic Church in particular, because of its hierarchy, because of its institutional size and power, because of the number of people who are Catholic, because of the moral authority that the Pope seems to wield internationally, for all of these reasons, I see the Catholic Church as being critically important to the restoration of some degree of sanity in how our society is structured and how we conduct ourselves both collectively and individually. So to summarize, I'm not making a critique based on theological grounds. I am making critiques based on basically on logic, if you want to use that term. And I'm doing it not because I think that people should abandon the Catholic Church. On the contrary, I see the Catholic Church as being overall a potential force for good and for the strengthening and healing of our society. It's not the only institution out there that plays that role or that can and should be playing that role, but it has a unique position historically and contemporarily in order to accomplish that. So, having said all of that, ladies and gentlemen, I want to talk, first of all, very briefly about same-sex marriage once again. And I'm not going to get into, there are other things, so I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on this, but I want to reiterate with some degree of caution and respect what we talked about last night. The Catholic Church is right now holding a conference of bishops, and they also have some ladies there and some lay people, but it's essentially a regular conference of bishops to discuss the practices of the church and certain theological aspects. And one of the things that Pope Francis, has talked about is the need to somehow, and he hasn't been really clear and explicit on this, but to somehow, without actually elevating same-sex relationships to the same theological status of marriage, nevertheless bringing same-sex relationships into the Catholic Church and invoking some kind of blessing, if you will, on those relationships. Now, I have my personal views. on both the moral aspect and the practical aspect of same-sex relationships. But it's a free country, and if you're consenting adults, you know, you're going to do what you want to do, and I'm not going to step in front of you on this, okay? I happen to be one of those people that agrees with Pierre Trudeau, Justin Trudeau's father, who once made the remark that the state has no business in the bedrooms of the people. And I agree with that. I think it's an unfortunate, and I won't say slippery slope, because that's when you're going the other direction. But I think it's unfortunate when the state feels that it has to spy on people's private lives in the bedroom of all places, and to prosecute people's consensual sexual activity. That doesn't mean I agree with it. I'm an Orthodox Jew. I follow the teachings of the Torah on this subject, and those teachings are quite explicit that it is sinful to undertake that kind of activity. Let me pause for a second and put that into context, though, for all of you people out there whose heads are exploding right now. What is also sinful, and on the same level of same-sex relations, is adultery. I also think that adultery is sinful. By the way, I also think that breaking the Sabbath is sinful, and eating non-kosher food for Jews is sinful. So don't throw stones at me. Sorry, no pun intended. Don't throw stones at me. Don't send me angry emails. Don't accuse me of being homophobic, anti-LGBTQ+++++. I'm not. I don't care. Having said that, I don't see how you can invoke God's blessing on this union in any way, shape, or form. Look, I get it. You love the sinner. But loving the sinner doesn't mean turning a blind eye to the sin. You can love the sinner, but you don't have to endorse the sin in order to love the sinner. You could still say to the sinner, out of love, what you're doing is wrong. So, that's the theological argument. If you don't believe in God and you don't believe in the authenticity or the authority of the Bible, you're going to do whatever you want to do. So don't get on the Catholic Church's case about it. Don't get on my case about it. I'm just saying, from a theological perspective, if you're the Catholic Church, then you should be, of course, love the sinner. But that doesn't mean that you have to embrace the sin. And on the contrary, from a theological perspective, you should still be speaking out against it because it is sinful. So how do you justify, in any way, shape, or form, bringing that group, bringing that relationship, and normalizing it to whatever degree you're talking about? How do you justify that? Because the whole justification, the whole basis for your Catholicism, if I was speaking to the Pope, I'd be interested in hearing how he answers this, but the whole basis of your religion, the whole foundation, is the idea that there is a God, and we know God from the Bible, therefore the Bible has to be authoritative. If the Bible is just an invention, then you can't use it to discuss God. So you can't just throw away portions of the Bible because, well, it's 2023 or 5784 if you happen to be Jewish, but I digress. You can't do that from a logical point of view. You cannot invoke God's blessing on an institution, on a relationship that is explicitly prohibited from the document, in the document from which you derive your authority to invoke that blessing. And that's not a theological argument, ladies and gentlemen. That is a logic argument. Period. Full stop. There's no theology whatsoever in that argument. So I don't get it. All right, I promised I wasn't going to spend that much time on this whole same-sex marriage business. And I'm not. I said a lot about it last night. I've already said more than enough about it tonight. I've just really reiterated, perhaps in more clear terms, what we discussed on last night's show. So go back, listen to the podcast. But what this Pope is talking about doesn't stop at same-sex marriage. He's also ignited what I think is a new controversy in what he had to say at this conference. And in order to jump into that, you're going to have to come back after the next break. So stay tuned, ladies and gentlemen. Much more to come. It's going to make your head explode, figuratively speaking. I'll be back in a couple of minutes here on the Joseph Ben-Ami Show. Gentlemen, we are back. You are tuned into the Joseph Ben-Ami Show for Wednesday, October the 4th, 2023. I'm your host, Joseph Ben-Ami. Thank you so much for sticking with us. We have been going over the conference, a synod, I think they call it in the Catholic Church, that is going on right now. And some of the things, the position that this current Pope, Pope Francis, seems to be taking, well, doesn't just seem to be taking, he is, with respect to some very controversial issues. And in the last segment, we talked, like we did last night, a little bit about the Pope's emerging position on same-sex relationships and same-sex marriage. All right, I said a lot about it last night. I said a lot about it already tonight. But this isn't the only thing that this Pope has been involved in. Now, if you want to talk about social issues, if you want to talk about poverty, if you want to talk about economic inequity, all of that's fair game for a Pope. And he does talk about these issues. I think he's way off base in terms of his understanding of the economics. I think he's way off base in terms of how he would define justice. For instance, the Bible doesn't really spend a whole lot of time talking about justice for the poor over at the expense of the rich. Yes, it's true. The Bible, New Testament, Old Testament, admonishes us to look after the poor, the homeless, feed the people who are hungry, clothe people who have no clothes, put a roof over the heads of people who need a shelter. All of that's true. All of that's important. But the Bible also explicitly admonishes us when it comes to issues of justice, of law, of right and wrong, not to favor the poor over the rich. A lot of people don't know that. So let me say that again. The Bible explicitly, plain English, or plain Hebrew if you want, sorry, admonishes us not to favor the poor over the rich. If you commit a crime, you can't come to a Jewish court and say, well, I'm poor, therefore I should be let off. It doesn't work that way. The law is the law, and justice has to be blind. So, right, I get it. You have a lot of money, you have an obligation to help people who have less. But just because you have less isn't a license to break the law. Hadn't intended to get into that subject, but since it presented itself, I just thought I'd make the observation. But whatever the Pope's views on social justice, etc., I use that term very loosely, that's fair game for the Pope. What's not fair game for the Pope is for him to come before the bishops and to talk about how the world is in peril because of climate change, and to admonish society, if you will, governments, but because he's speaking to collectively, for the most part, a group of bishops, I assume that he's saying you have to go back to your home countries and you have to pressure governments to do more about climate change. And the words he's using are, it's almost too late. If we don't act now, it's going to be too late. Interesting position to take. Why am I criticizing this? Well, first of all, because it's a scientific issue, and I think the Pope is dead wrong about this. Okay? No surprises there hearing that from me if you're a regular listener to this show. But more importantly, I have a question to ask. And I'm talking here again about the integrity of the Catholic Church as the Catholic Church. Not as a secular institution, but as a religious, theological institution. I'm wondering how you fit that eschatology, that end of days scenario, the notion that the world is on the verge of being destroyed, or humanity is on the verge of extinction. How does that jive with the biblical promise that God has made that he's not going to destroy humanity? Or, if you want to say, well, maybe he won't, but maybe human beings are going to destroy themselves. Okay, that's an interesting point of view, but certainly, when we talk about the end of days, when we talk about the prophecies in the New Testament, in Revelations, when we talk about Armageddon, etc., there's a very clear narrative there. There's a very clear set of prophecies. And humankind destroying itself through climate change, I don't know. I don't see how it fits in. And if it does fit in, it seems to me that it fits in with the narrative itself. So I'm not entirely sure that I understand what the point is of the Pope in lecturing anybody about climate change. I don't understand. First of all, clearly he doesn't have the authority to do this. Clearly, he doesn't have the scientific knowledge to do this, but look, give the guy a break. He's no better or worse informed or, frankly, intelligent on this issue than many other people out there who are leaders in their communities, national leaders. It's people have gone completely bonkers about this. So, okay, fine. He's thinking the way he's thinking. As I say, he's no better informed or less informed than anybody else is. So, I mean, I've heard this from so many people. We all have. But how does this fit into the mandate of the Catholic Church? Are we suggesting, or is the Pope suggesting, that the Catholic Church has to engage in this fight because somehow or other this is going to help restore the health of the souls, the spiritual health of members of the church or of society at large where the church is active? I don't see this. I don't see this as being part of their mandate. And again, this is not a theological argument. It may be more of a political argument, but it's not theological. Absolutely not. So how is this part of the role of the Catholic Church? And if you're going to involve yourself, if you're going to insert yourself into this debate with this degree of controversy, then why are you not willing to stand up on issues of morality? Why are you not willing to issue a statement, for example, decrying the behavior of so many people at these pride parades? And yes, I've said it, and people are going to, heads exploding. I can hear it already. I can see it in my mind. How could you say that about pride parades? Well, have you ever seen what goes on at a pride parade? Simulated sex acts? Public nudity? Surely to goodness, this is something that fits directly into what the Catholic Church ought to be concerned about. Surely to goodness, this is something that the Pope ought to be speaking out against. And he doesn't have to say, well, we Catholics. He can talk in general moral terms. The degradation of human behavior, of sexuality, which is a wonderful, beautiful, intimate thing between a man and a woman. But not a word. Do they have a pride parade in Rome? Outside of the walls of the Vatican? Does he say anything about it? I haven't heard one peep from the Catholic Church. Forget about the Pope, okay? I think the Pope should be leading on this, but I don't hear bishops in local communities speaking out against this. And I'm using Pride Parade as an example. But what about euthanasia? Where is the Pope and the Catholic Church on the subject of euthanasia? Surely this, again, is something that fits hand in glove their mandate. Not a word. If anything, I suspect that this Pope supports it on the false notion that somehow or other it's compassionate to kill people who are ill, depressed, who are suffering. I understand feeling compassionate because people are suffering. I want to help people who are suffering also. But shouldn't the church be leading the charge on the subject of we should be spending our resources not on killing people to end their suffering, but on mitigating their suffering by finding cures to the illnesses that are plaguing them. It seems to me that that should be the position of the Catholic Church, but I don't hear a word about it. Instead, I have to read the words of the Pope on climate change. There's something fundamentally wrong, and I apologize to my Catholic friends. I don't mean to be offensive. I don't mean to offend anybody. It's not my goal. I hope you understand that. I could be just as critical of Jewish groups. I could be just as critical of Christian evangelical groups. I'm just speaking about the Pope and the Catholic Church because, A, I think that the Church is in a position of authority and a potential position of influence, as I said earlier in the show, to have a positive impact on subjects like this. And I think that they're abdicating their responsibility in this respect, or worse. And of course, I'm reacting to the words, the statements of the Pope himself. When Justin Trudeau speaks about climate change here in Canada, I'm critical of him and the Liberal Party as well. All right, ladies and gentlemen, time for us to go for our final break of the evening. So stay with us when we get back this day in history. And a few parting words on some of the subjects we've talked about tonight. And maybe a couple of more subjects that we just want to touch on ever so slightly. Stay tuned. We do have lots more to come. Back, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for staying with us. You are tuned into the Joseph Ben-Ami Show for Wednesday, October the 4th, 2023. I'm your host, Joseph Ben-Ami. I appreciate you staying with us. So before we talk about this day in history, a couple of other things that were in the news today. If you've been following the story here in Canada about last week, President Zelensky from the Ukraine was visiting and he spoke at Parliament. And while he was there, the Speaker of the House, Anthony Rota, recognized the presence in the gallery of the House of Commons an individual who was a World War II veteran, who was of Ukrainian ethnicity, and had been invited, I assume, by the Prime Minister's office to witness this historic occasion of the President of the Ukraine speaking to the Canadian people through their parliament. And when he was recognized, he got a standing ovation, etc. Shortly afterwards, it was revealed that this individual, he was a World War II veteran, but he had fought on the side of the Nazis. And something like this was not really that unusual. Most Ukrainians were anti-German, but there was a sizable proportion of the population that was pro-German because they saw the Germans as being liberators, because remember, the Ukraine was a republic in the Soviet Union. So a number of young Ukrainian men actually joined the Nazis, either fighting for them directly within a unit of the German army, or they served in different capacities in the occupied territories in Eastern Europe, in Poland in particular, and many Ukrainians served as concentration camp guards or auxiliary police in Jewish ghettos in large cities in Poland, where Jews were forced to live prior to them being transported to extermination camps. This is not an indictment on Ukraine, the country. This is not an indictment on all Ukrainians, far from it, but it is a fact that a disproportionate number of Ukrainians did participate in the war on the side of the Germans. So that was revealed, and it was a tremendous embarrassment. The Prime Minister apologized to the Canadian people in the House of Commons. The Speaker of the House, Anthony Rota, stepped down. He resigned, and that probably should have been where it was left, except now we know that we just learned that the former leader, president, I should say, of the Progressive Conservative Party in Alberta was himself, in the 1980s, was himself he was of Ukrainian descent, and he had also served, ironically, in the same unit as this fellow in Ottawa just last week. And not only that, but this individual also was head of a university in Alberta, and he is a member of the Order of Canada. Now, if you read the news reports, they'll say he was awarded the Order of Canada. You don't get awarded the Order of Canada. It's not a prize that you get. It's an institution that you are inducted into. So you become a member of the Order of Canada. You don't get an Order of Canada medal or anything like that. So just a little bit of a trivia correction. Anyway, so this is a story that is just breaking now, and our Governor General has issued an apology, and I'm assuming that the next step is you're going to see this individual expelled from the Order of Canada. I don't know what's happening here. You know, in 1987, when he became a member of the Order of Canada, that was around the same time that the Mulroney government was in place, and there was a War Crimes Commission at the time, and there was a real effort to figure out what to do with former Nazis who came and settled in Canada. So you would have thought that somehow or other he would have been caught up in that, but the answer is no. Now there's a lot of pressure for the government to open up its files on former Nazis who are living in Canada. I don't know about that. I have to think carefully about that, and I'm making a mental note to myself. I think what we'll do is maybe we'll talk about that a little bit further tomorrow night. So that's my teaser for tomorrow night's show. In the meantime, I promised you, again, as usual, home stretch today in history. So, a lot of different things happening in history on this day. In the year 1582, the Gregorian calendar was introduced, and over the following centuries, there are a number of countries that have adopted the Gregorian calendar. Very similar to other calendars, but not exactly the same. What else? In the year 1853, the Crimean War started between Russia and the Turkish Empire, the Ottoman Empire. And shortly after the start of the war, the British and the French joined the Ottomans in fighting the Russians. And there are a couple of really interesting things that came out of the Crimean War. The first is Florence Nightingale, who was a nurse in the Crimean War, who became well known and famous, if you will, for her efforts to treat wounded and stem disease on the battlefield. So that was Florence Nightingale. But another thing that happened, the Charge of the Light Brigade. Look that one up on Google. The Charge of the Light Brigade was conducted during the Crimean War. Okay, what else happened on this day? In 1957, the Soviets, I want to call them the Russians, but they're really the Soviets, launched the first Sputnik 1, which was a satellite that was orbiting the Earth. And the launch of this particular satellite precipitated what ended up being known as the space race. It was a shocking development to Americans when they learned that the Russians were so far technologically advanced. In fact, apparently more advanced than the Americans themselves were. That was deemed to be intolerable, and so the Americans ratcheted up their whole technology development and the whole space development, developing satellites, launching them, and eventually putting a man into orbit and sending a crew to the moon, landing on the moon. So all of that started on this day in the year 1957. All right, ladies and gentlemen, coming to the end of another frenetic hour here on the Joseph Ben-Ami Show. I appreciate the fact that you tuned in, as always. Check out the website, www.josephbenami.com, all one word without a hyphen. While you're there, check out our list of books to read. If you have any suggestions on adding books, please do send me an email. Use the contact form right there on the website. And feel free to use that contact form in order to send me any kind of comments that you might have about the subject that we talked about tonight, or any other subject. While you're on the website, you can check out our archive of podcasts, all of the shows available on audio podcast right there on that website. Tell your friends and neighbors about us, because we like to expand our audience. And if you're catching us on YouTube or Rumble or any of those social media platforms, click on subscribe and click on like. Doesn't cost you anything, ladies and gentlemen, but it does help build our listenership and our viewership. All right, ladies and gentlemen, well, that's it for this evening. Again, thanks so much for joining in, and we will catch you tomorrow night here on the Joseph Ben-Ami Show. In the meantime, God bless you, and whatever you do, do not, ladies and gentlemen, do not drink the Kool-Aid.